Here's something most people don't know. The biggest shock German prisoners felt when they arrived in Britain wasn't the camp, the guards, or the rules. It was the first meal placed in front of them. Many thought it was a mistake. Some thought it was a test. Others simply didn't understand why Britain would offer it at all. But that moment became one of the clearest signs that the war they had imagined and the war they were now living were two very different things. When German POWs arrived in Britain, many came straight from the harsh conditions of surrender, transport, overcrowded holding areas, and long, exhausting journeys. They expected punishment, hostility, and the strict food shortages they themselves had been told the British were dealing with. Instead, they were led into canteens and handed a plate of food that seemed completely out of place for wartime. Hot meals, fresh bread, tea, sometimes even butter or jam. Small things for Britain, but huge things for men who expected very little. The reaction from the prisoners was almost always the same: confusion. Why would a nation that was fighting them offer something warm, filling, and surprisingly generous? Many POWs wrote later that they assumed the first meal would be the worst part of camp life. Instead, it became a moment they never forgot. Some reports describe prisoners sitting silently, unsure whether they were allowed to eat. Others describe men waiting for guards to take the food away. They didn't understand that Britain had a strict policy. Prisoners would be fed properly, not starved or mistreated. For many POWs, this was their first contact with British soldiers outside of combat. They expected anger, insults, or resentment. What they found instead were guards who told them to eat up and get settled. The meal wasn't a gesture of friendship, it was a rule. Britain saw it as a duty to treat prisoners according to standards that had been set long before the war began. And this meant no humiliation, no deprivation, and no deliberate suffering. To German soldiers raised on wartime propaganda, this difference was difficult to process. The food itself played a huge role in shaping their view. British meals during the war were simple but consistent. A stew with vegetables, boiled potatoes, or sliced bread might sound unremarkable. But to many POWs, it felt like a relief they didn't expect. Some came from front-line units that had been living on stretched rations. Others came from submarines or air crews who had gone days with barely anything to eat. And a few had experienced long periods of hunger during retreats. Suddenly being given a proper meal was more than surprising. It was almost unsettling. The real shock came when the prisoners learned the meals weren't special. They were standard, daily, predictable, something they could rely on. This stability changed the atmosphere in the camps. It reduced tension, it helped prevent violence, and it created an environment where many POWs began to see their captors very differently from how they had imagined them. Some even wrote that the first meal was the moment they realized they were going to survive the war. Another layer to this story is how Britain viewed the long-term value of proper treatment. A prisoner who was fed, housed, and given work was easier to manage. Starving them would only create unrest. So the first meal wasn't just kindness, it was policy, strategy, and practicality. German prisoners who expected to be humiliated instead found a system that treated them with a level of structure and humanity they didn't anticipate. What makes this moment stand out is how often it appeared in diaries and post-war interviews. Many POWs remembered it decades later, not because the food was luxurious, but because it represented a sudden change from fear to a strange kind of stability. A moment that showed them the war wasn't going to follow the rules they expected, and it revealed something important about Britain's approach to captivity. The goal wasn't revenge, it was control, calmness, and order. The first meal German POWs received in Britain didn't end the war for them. It didn't erase what had happened on the battlefield, but it marked a shift in their understanding of what captivity would be like. a shift that began with a simple plate of food they never expected to see, and one that stayed with them long after the conflict ended.